Is there ever a case for someone saying, look, I like to eat low carb or even keto for 6 months and then switch to a more standard omnivore caloric maintenance type diet and then switch back? Is there any downside to doing that for sake of health or weight loss over time or weight maintenance over time? Because I realize not everyone is trying to lose weight. And I definitely want to talk about at some point how to eat to maintain weight, because I think there are a significant fraction of people out there who are trying to do that. But yeah, is there any downside to being a dabbler, keto for a few months and then omnivore for a few months, et cetera?
I think that's actually a great thing, especially to like maybe find what you feel is easiest for you, right? But in terms of like as a strategy, I mean, I guess, some people, this might get into dopamine, but like, change and get something new and like, you feel a little bit more positive about it.
The new partner model.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it's how I would usually set things up initially for somebody. But if somebody said, hey, I just like to have some variety and change it up, as long as they're still like, their behaviors and they're doing portion control or whatever it is, and they're able to sustain a calorie deficit or, depending on whatever their goal is, I don't think there's really any downside to it. I do think the one thing to keep in mind is when you look at like going between extremes, so like low fat to low carb or vice versa, there can be in that transition period a little bit of weirdness, for lack of a better term. Like, for example, if you've been on a ketogenic diet and all of a sudden you move to like a higher carb diet, you'll be like basically insulin resistant for just a short period of time. Now, is that going to cause any health problems? Probably not in the long term, especially if you're still controlling calories. But just because your body has kind of like upregulated these systems dealing mostly with fat and glucose production rather than glucose metabolism. So now if you start taking glucose or carbohydrate back in, like for example, you give somebody an oral glucose tolerance test after they've been on keto, they'll do pretty terribly at it. But that doesn't last that long.
About how long?
A few weeks.
I think that's important for people to know, because I have a feeling during those first few weeks are the period of time when a lot of people will go running back to what they were doing previously, which is not to say that they shouldn't, but I've certainly done that. I've tried very low carbohydrate diet, and I would have assumed, and now I know I'm completely wrong, but I assumed that I was so carbohydrate starved for so long that my insulin sensitivity, which is a good thing, by the way, folks, would have gone through the roof, and I would be able to just sponge up every bit of glucose that I would have ingested through carbohydrate. So I did indeed switch over, and I felt like I had pretty terrible brain fog. I even got some jitters, and I thought, wait, what is this? My blood sugar was low before. Now my blood sugar should be in more moderate territory. But based on what you just said, I had upregulated the enzymes and systems in the body for fat metabolism on the keto diet, and then switching over, there was basically a ramping up of the molecules involved in presumably in glycolysis.
Transition period. I mean, think about it, like if you haven't weight trained before and you start weight training, you're going to feel pretty terrible, right? Like you're going to be sore and stiff and all that kind of stuff. But I will say you aren't necessarily wrong in what you said about being more insulin sensitive, because it depends on how you measure insulin sensitivity. So if you measure with something like, fasting blood glucose or fasting insulin or even HOMA-IR, those tend to be pretty good on low carb. But then if you do an oral glucose tolerance test, it tends to be pretty bad. And so it depends on your specific measure, right? So I think that, the idea that keto makes you, glucose intolerant or insulin resistant, I think, again, it's just a transition period, and I'm not too worried about it. But it is something important to keep in mind. And one of the reasons, like if somebody was to transition out of keto, typically if like I'm working with them or one of our coaches are working with them, we'll kind of instruct them to do it like slowly and kind of systematically over like a 4 to 8 week period. That way, hopefully, they're not having that period of 2 weeks where they're like, oh man, why do I feel so terrible?
Very important point.